One or two of you mentioned this next one as what you believe was the most convincing of them. And I happen to think the third way is actually the one that is most difficult to kick to the curb also. The third way appeals to the concepts of necessity and contingency. Now, this argument is a major linchpin in Father Friedrich Copleston's argument for the existence of God. He says, look around you. All of the things that you experience in this world are contingent things. Now, here's what we mean by contingent things. Things that are dependent upon other things than themselves for their being. I am a contingent thing. I came into existence at relatively recent time, geologically speaking. I will go out of existence almost as quickly as I came in. I am dependent upon food, water, and exercise for my continued sustenance. I can also conceive of a world in which I never what? In which I never existed. There is nothing about me that is necessary. And what Copleston and Aquinas would say is, every single thing in the world that you experience, a physical thing, is contingent. Now here's the linchpin of the argument. Suppose that all of the things that have ever existed were contingent things. If that were the case, then it would be possible for what to have existed? Nothing. If it were possible for nothing to exist, then nothing would have existed. And by the way, if nothing at one time existed, what would exist now? Nothing. This is why, according to this argument, there must have always been there must have always been something that existed. And to go a little further, only one being would be up to that task. A necessary being. And take a guess what hypothetical being seems to fit that bill? God. And now I'm going to play St. Thomas Aquinas for you for a minute. Because not only does he appeal to Aristotle in his Summa Theologica, he also appeals to what other authoritative source? The Scripture, the Bible. As it is written, I am the Alpha and the Omega, that which is, was, and ever shall be. As it is written. The Scripture tells us that God is that which is, was, and ever shall be. That is the divine Scripture telling us, essentially, that God is that necessary being that has always what? That God has always existed. Now, Bertrand Russell would have some beefs with this argument, as you probably already gathered. Number one, even if you did accept this argument that something has always existed, it still wouldn't prove that it was God, let alone what? Yeah, let alone the Christian God. And by the way, Russell, as a skeptical empiricist, will also say you really shouldn't make claims beyond what your experience can verify. Can we be absolutely certain that things have not always existed? Contingent things. Can we be sure that reality this thing that we call time is even best described this way. One of the reasons why these arguments make so darn much sense to most Westerners is because we are taught to look at time in a linear fashion. Because our lives are linear. I had a finite beginning and I'm going to go out in finite time. And I can describe my life as a sort of spatio-temporal timeline. But what if, as some of the Eastern religions explain it, what if in fact time were actually this? What if time is better explained cyclically? Because after all, these things that change annually that we call the seasons are a cycle. Every single day is a cycle. Birth, school, work, death, that's a cycle. There are cycles all around us. What if it's actually the case that cosmic time is also cyclical rather than linear? What if the universe has always existed? And what if it goes through these cycles of expansion, decline, destruction, rebirth? Expansion, decline, destruction, rebirth. What if the Hindus had it right? What if, in fact, the god Shiva actually explains the cosmos better? You've all seen statuary of Shiva as Lord of the Cosmic Dance. It's beautiful statuary. But yeah, a wonderful deity. And I can understand why many Hindus are devotees of Shiva. Because he embraces what? Embraces death. Because without death, yeah, life is not possible. I mean, many of these other religions embrace the idea that perhaps time is cyclical. How do we know that time isn't cyclical? How do we know that the universe hasn't always existed? And why do we need to say, well, there had to be just one God, and we use what kind of language to talk about that one God? We use patriarchal language. We also use, well, I guess I already said it by patriarchal. We also personify him as a man. Perhaps all of these assumptions are what?
Wrong.
Yeah, perhaps all of these assumptions are wrong. Perhaps we are so arrogant to claim that we think we know more than we can know. I'm running out of time, so I have to talk about these last two.
What do you want?
Thank you. The fourth way is one of my personal favorites, by the way. I think it's difficult to do justice to the fourth way. I also happen to think that it's the most difficult one for the modern mind to wrap around. This is the argument that appeals to the concept of degrees or gradation when it comes to this thing called perfection. Now this fourth way, we actually find a version of it in both Plato and Aristotle. What the fourth way appeals to is this concept. You guys know what plenitude is? Plenitude refers to the fact that this thing that we call the cosmos is multifarious, multifaceted, filled with a variety of all kinds of different things. Now, as a small child brought up a Christian, I asked this question that maybe some of you have asked. We used to go to the South Jersey Atlantic seashore, once every summer. And the first time I spied what they called a horseshoe crab, I was like, ew, disgusting. Why would God have created something so damn ugly? Anyone else know what I'm talking about? Why are if many children are afraid of like bugs and stuff? Why would God have created these grotesque looking bugs? Well, guess what the fourth way says? It is in the vastness, it is in the plenitude that God's greatness can be seen. And take a guess what there is in this plenitude. Did I hear somebody say it? There's beauty in it. Even though its beauty is sometimes difficult for us to appreciate from our anthropocentric position. Simply because the horseshoe crab might be ugly to 5-year-old Johnny does not mean it is not complex and beautiful in its kind. The glory of all these things attests to the power and glory and greatness of the deity, according to this argument. All the way down to the most simple of organisms, all the way up. Who's at the top of this? I don't have much time to talk about this, but this concept, or this answer to this question, why would God create a world with so many different things in it? Things that seem to have no clear purpose to them. Seem to be ugly in their kind. Well, this argument says no. Everything is beautiful and in its place exactly the way God intended it. And all of it attests to the greater beauty of the whole. This concept that I'm trying to spell out briefly, it is a medieval concept that is known as the great chain of being. And by the way, you know who the being is, right? God is the being. The being upon which all of this multiplicity depends. And the fact that there is so much attests not just to the idea that God is a creator, but also attests to the idea that I'm starting to humanize God here. And guess what? This argument kind of tries to do that a little bit. God is not a man, God is not a human being. But God must have some kind of an aesthetic sense. In other words, cosmic beauty. Now, of course, you're not necessarily going to see cosmic beauty unless what? Unless you've humbled yourself enough to it, and unless you give it a shot. No wonder 5-year-old little Johnny thought, ew, gross. But at this point, and this is not religious per se, I'm telling you right here, this is not religious, but I appreciate the idea that there is beauty in the simplest of things, if you're willing to look for it. And that these things, that to the 5-year-old me, I'm like, well, why would that even have to exist? Well, I'm like, this thing is basically hundreds of millions of years old, genetically speaking. Isn't that fascinating? It's existed, creatures like that have existed, you know, hundreds of millions of years before historical time. I think there's a certain amount of interest in that. Now, of course, the critic would say, this still doesn't prove the existence of God, let alone the Christian God and all of its peculiar doctrines. But it does attempt to explain, you know, why the variety in the world would be consistent with a being like this that also has a sort of aesthetic sense. And it appeals to the idea of the cosmic beauty of all of it. Even things that to our human eyes might at first seem, you know, to be ugly, insignificant. Or you might even say, why should that have even been created? And I'll give you one. I've always wondered why, if there's a wonderful, powerful, loving God, why God would have created the hookworm. The hookworm's a parasite. Mark Twain uses this as an example in his sacrilegious book. Oh, it's sacrilegious. I said that on purpose. That's our joke word for it. Yeah, the sacrilegious book, Letters from Earth. The guy writing these letters is Lucifer, who's been kicked out of heaven, who's basically making fun of how stupid God's creatures are. Humans, I mean. So arrogant, so boastful. But yeah, he says, they actually think they're God's favorite.
Is this book readable?
Yes, it is. It's funny as hell.
Sounds like...
Seriously, it's a satire, by the way. And by the way, Mark Twain was not necessarily making fun of religion per se, but he was making fun of a lot of believers who don't really think things through very much. He is also making fun of human folly. But anyways, there's just as much reason to believe that God's favorite creation is the hookworm. Because the hookworm doesn't suffer. The hookworm has plenty of what? There's plenty of hosts. And when the host animal dies, it goes dormant until it's time for another host animal. It multiplies, multiplies, multiplies. And by the way, long after human beings have extincted themselves, there will still be what?
Hookworm.
There will still be hookworms. Just like there will still likely be horseshoe crabs. But yeah, human beings and their arrogance. Now, I think it's about that time. I'm going to pick up next time, and I'm going to briefly race through the fifth way. But the nice thing about the fifth way is it will segue us right into the problem.